June 25th, 1944, Saipan, just below the cliffs near Marpi Point, the island breathing heat like a kiln. A patrol from the 2nd Marine Division moved in staggered file when the sound reached us. Thin, high, impossible. A baby crying from inside stone. PFC Joe Ramirez, a corpsman with a first aid pouch cinched tight and a carbine clattering his ribs, went to ground without a word. The cave mouth exhaled cordite and rot. Someone had pulled pins. He felt for tripwires with his knuckles and whispered the old field mantra, "Slow is smooth." He could smell the dust the way you taste a matchstick after a strike. Somewhere to his right, a voice in Japanese tried to be smaller than fear. Outside, an LVTA-4 idled, its turreted 75 lowered like a guardian's brow. Beside it, an M4A2 Sherman nosed into rock, diesel coughing, metal ticking as it cooled, the crew chief watching the ridge through binoculars. The reef boomed beyond, and farther still the silhouettes of hospital ships held their place against the horizon as if pressed there by a steady hand. Ramirez eased past a grenade, found the mother, and for a breath they stared at each other across a gulf of propaganda. She braced for an ending she had been promised since childhood. He pointed to the light and touched his canteen to his lips, then to hers. The baby's cry hitched, surprised by the taste of water. Behind him, a private unrolled a poncho and crouched to make a circle of shade. The Marines had done this a dozen times already with wounded civilians, but a newborn on the 3rd week of the battle was a different order of business. Ramirez drew the infant close, told the mother they would move, and slid backward, heel by feel, slow as geology. They emerged into glare and engine noise. A runner had the radio handset up, calling the civilian hospital by Camp Susupe. The words sounded improbable even to American ears. Maternity in a war zone, but the chain was real. Jeep to triage tent, bottles to boil, plasma to warm. The mother clutched her belly with one hand and the poncho with the other. The baby's eyes fluttered in the sun like two damp moths. A corporal guided them toward the LVT's ramp. "Easy does it," he said, and the phrase, "ordinary as chow," felt like a flag. Ramirez looked past the dunes at the road jammed with trucks, cranes and water cans, and understood again what the enemy could not. An ocean full of ships meant Mercy could ride to battle in the open, no apology required. He signalled the driver, and the tractor lurched seaward, bow toward the camp and the waiting tents where steam and discipline would do their quiet work. The jeep skated through coral dust to a square of canvas city that smelled of iodine and hot metal. The civilian hospital beside Camp Susupe had gone up in days, guy lines taut, cots in ranks, lamps hooded against night. Lieutenant Ruth Ellison, Army Nurse Corps, watch pinned above her heart, ran the ward with a quartermaster's brain and a mother's patience. Her requisitions read like a litany: field stoves, hand-crank autoclaves, plasma tins, powdered milk, rubber nipples, safety pins, and the interpreters who made promises meaningful. Procedure turned chaos into routine. Triage, feed, rest. Haruko, she gave the name softly, flinched at every American syllable until a Nisei sergeant from the Military Intelligence Service knelt and spoke Japanese with island cadence. "You are safe," he said. "You will eat." "The baby will drink," Ellison nodded once and set the dance. Parboil the bottle, rinse with chlorinated water, shake milk to the line on the tin, test the temperature on a wrist already tattooed with steam burns. Her chart for the maternity corner fit on the back of a ration box. Feeds at 2, 5, 8, diapers boiled at 11, linens rotated at dusk. If fever, warm plasma in a water bath. If breathing shallow, elevate and watch. Through the canvas came everything at once: the clack of typewriters, the cough of a generator, the thud of crates. A white ship off the reef waited to take severe cases. Boat crews rehearsed the litter path to the beach with the precision of a drill team. A supply corporal read off stock numbers Ellison hadn't known before the war, but now handled like scripture. Posted hours marked vaccinations and prenatal checks. Grandmothers hovered to watch the baby breathe, hands folded like parishioners at a new church. The corpsman from the cave kept close with the protective awkwardness of a young man who had touched the hinge of life and couldn't quite release it. Ellison let him hold the infant's ankle while she listened to the mother's chest. Outside, rain began to test the canvas, a Pacific tattoo. Inside, steam lifted, turning lamplight to fog. War makes its own weather. The trick is to keep the climate of a ward steady despite it. "You'll sleep," she told Haruko through the MIS sergeant. "We'll wake you for feeds." She clicked her watch, filed another ledger line, and moved to the next cot without slowing. The tented plant held roughly 150 beds, with overflow cots ready to unfold when a landing pushed another wave of civilians through the gate. Night cooled the ridges and brought the staff together under a tent where maps glowed like islands inside an island. Grease pencil lines traced the day's gains, while a clerk sharpened a stub of pencil down to its bones. V Amphibious Corps briefed the next morning's sweeps. 2nd Marine Division, 4th Marine Division, Army's 27th Infantry Division on the left hook, artillery and defilade, Shermans to nose the draws. On the same table lay a ledger that did not look like war at all: rice, blankets, bottles, clinic hours. Yet its columns would shape the island as surely as any fire plan. The Civil Affairs Directive was plain: disarm, segregate feed, treat enemy civilians without prejudice, offer inspection to the International Committee of the Red Cross when practicable. A young lieutenant who had never delivered a baby read the paragraph twice and whistled low. The operations officer tapped the board with a stick. "Loudspeakers here and here," he said. "Leaflets by noon, interpreter teams with each company." Marines who had spent the afternoon with grenades found themselves detailed to escort grandmothers at 900 hours. Nobody balked. The war had its own arithmetic. Ramirez stood in the back with a cup of burnt coffee and felt the gravity of the thing. Combat power budgeted for milk. Outside, an M4A2 ticked as its block cooled. At the perimeter, a tank crew stretched a tarp from their hull to make a patch of shade where civilians could queue for the water cans. Ellison's name appeared on the assignments board with the same ink as the artillery liaison. That meant the maternity corner was not a whim, it was a line of operation. The numbers made their own kind of drumbeat. Before spring even turned, American factories had accepted 1,890 LVTA-4 amphibious gun vehicles, 75mm howitzers on tracks that could nose through reef and carry refugees as easily as Marines. The defenders of Saipan, for their part, had roughly 80 tanks in all. It was a 20-to-1 language anyone could understand. Even Mercy could ride under armour. A sergeant chalked water on a signboard with an arrow toward the camp. Another hand added in smaller letters, "Shade." At the end of the brief, the Corps Chief summarized in the same voice he used for artillery fire missions. "We will stabilize the civilian situation. That reduces friction on maneuver and accelerates runway construction." No one argued. The lieutenant folded the civil affairs pages into his map case next to the overlays. When the lamps were doused, the tent turned black and the island returned. Surf beating the reef, rain tickling canvas. Somewhere, a baby finding sleep to the rhythm of a generator. The plan felt strange only until you looked seaward and counted hulls. Then the logic clicked like a well-oiled bolt. Morning struck metal. Cranes swung nets of crates from LSTs to pontoon causeways, their cables singing in a salt wind. LVT-4S backed into the chop, their ramps sloshing like tongues. DUKWs nosed forward, tyres ghosting under green water, then climbed the beach to spill water cans and medical chests in neat stacks. The air smelled of diesel, wet rope, and something sweet from busted K-ration tins. A logistics sergeant with a clipboard that had survived 3 landings ticked boxes, while a CB yelled for a dozer to push a berm before the tide took another bite. Everything moved on time, as if time itself wore stripes. The road to Camp Susupe clogged with benevolence, Trucks heaved 5-gallon cans like muskets from a century that never imagined this one. Field stoves rode lashed to tailgates, autoclaves came in their own wooden cradles, plasma tins clinked with a sound Ramirez would one day hear in his sleep. Ellison met the convoy with sleeves rolled and a ledger page folded to today. She parcelled the stoves to the maternity corner and to the vaccination line, posted boiling hours in grease pencil, and passed the interpreter a phrase card that said simply, "Every 3 hours." At the reef line, white hulls held their place the way mountains do on a clear day. A hospital ship's boats came, took, and returned. No commentary, no ceremony. Civilians moved along the path under Marine guard, not prisoners in chains, but human cargo through a system that had made room for them. A corporal remembered to tell each mother how long the ride would take. The interpreter memorized the phrase and began to say it first, as if time itself were a ration America could afford to hand out. If the enemy had watched from the ridge, he would have mistaken it for extravagance, idling Shermans to throw shade across the queue, an amphibious tractor assigned to nothing but waterhaul, entire engineer sections diverted to dig a drainage ditch so the clinic floor wouldn't flood in the afternoon squall. But abundance here was not theatre, it was throughput. The runway grew another 100 yards while the bottle rack filled another row. A lieutenant marked both gains on the same map with different pencils and felt they belonged to one operation. By noon, the camp smelled faintly of coffee, bleach, and baby breath, which seemed like a violation of some unwritten rule about battle and what belonged inside its lines. Ellison turned her watch and announced feeds. The logistics sergeant drew a finger across his clipboard, satisfied that nothing had dropped out of the pipe. Ramirez, standing at the door flap with his sleeves damp from scrubbing, realized that a machine capable of moving divisions could also, without any special strain, carry a cradle. The afternoon sun struck the reef like glass, and the convoy kept coming, indifferent to poetry, relentless as tide, each crate a small declaration that there would be enough. In the damp breath of a limestone gallery, Lieutenant Junior Grade Tadashi Mori squared his pocket notebook against the wall and wrote what he had been told to write. Americans deceive, then kill. He had believed it through Shanghai, through training films that showed barbarians with easy smiles. Now, from the cave mouth, he watched a Marine put down his rifle and pick up a water can. He watched a tank idle for an hour, engine grumbling like a patient ox, to cast shade over a line of old men and women. He watched a line move according to a schedule pinned to a board instead of the whim of a bayonet. 2 scouts he had sent at dawn returned before noon without wounds and with chocolate. Their hands shook, not from fear this time, but from sugar. They reported cots in rows, women with white armbands, and a tent where bottles steamed like rice pots. They quoted a Japanese voice amplified through a horn. "Your families are safe at Susupe. There is food. You will not be harmed." Mori had been taught to count bullets. The enemy counted hours and gallons. The arithmetic suggested different gods. He peered at the American tank through slits of sun. M4A2, diesel, the silhouette he knew from recognition cards. By his estimate, it drank fuel he could not imagine allotting to anything but attack, yet here it was, loitering to keep civilians from heat stroke. Waste, his instructors would have said. He thought of the captain who had ordered grenades for families, and of the mother he had seen lifted from a cave with her infant alive and pink. Waste, he tried to repeat. The word failed to hold. He wrote a cautious line in his notebook. Hospital ships stand off the reef. Probable ruse. Then he listened, and from the wind came another sound he could not fit into doctrine, the small laughter of a child lulled by a voice he could not see. The patrols kept their distance, rifles at low ready, helmets shining like damp stones. No jeering, no kicks, no Yankee swagger from a newsreel, just procedure, the most unnerving spectacle of all. When a leaflet tumbled into his lap, its ink still damp, he read it twice. It did not threaten. It offered a schedule, Clinic hours, meal times, the distance by boat to the white ship beyond the reef. Schedules were not supposed to be weapons. Yet he felt the point slide under his armour. If a nation could spare time like this, what else could it spare? He closed the notebook and for the first time did not know what he would write tomorrow. The cave pressed its heat against his back, but the horizon had shifted. Somewhere beyond the reef, a ship's whistle sounded, and he found himself counting not bullets, but boats. Evening brought a squall that stitched the canvas with needles of rain. Inside the maternity corner, Ellison turned her luminous dial and counted breaths. Haruko's contractions came regular as surf. Bottles clicked on a rack like glass metronomes. The autoclave chuffed steam into the lamplight, and Ramirez warmed a plasma tin in a water bath the way he'd been taught at Camp Pendleton. A Nisei interpreter crouched by the cot and breathed with the mother, phrases in Japanese softening into sound more than words, timing the rise and fall like a metered prayer. Offshore, carriers turned into the wind. The battle brief 2 decks below would have been crisp. Enemy raids inbound, Hellcats to deck edge, anti-air crews to stations, search radars painting the night. By morning, the reckoning began to tally in a sky men remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Numbers that felt like fiction hardened into fact. Roughly 123 American aircraft lost against some 600 Japanese destroyed, an exchange you almost had to say twice to believe. The replacement math leaned only one way. Ellison did not know the count, only that the child arrived with a long cry and a fist like a sea creature unfurling. She placed the baby on the mother's chest and saw the surprise, the way terror drained and left only exhaustion. The interpreter smiled through tears he pretended were sweat. Outside, rain quit as suddenly as it began. A Marine stepped to the flap and eased it open so a breeze could find the room. A tank engine coughed once, then settled back to its idle. Later, when the night had thinned, news would drift ashore in fragments from boats and radios. The enemy's carrier air mauled beyond quick repair. In 1944 alone, the United States would produce on the order of 96,000 aircraft, more in a single year than Japan managed across the entire war. That was the impossible truth behind the quiet of the tent. Losses, tragic and individual, could be replaced. Mercy, humble and procedural, could be repeated. The baby did not care about production curves. The mother did not know the word for throughput. They only learned that a bottle would be warmed and then another, on schedule. By dawn, the canvas smelled of soap and milk. Ellison noted a time and a weight and tucked the ledger beneath her pillow. Ramirez stepped outside and watched the sky braid itself pink. Far out, a carrier's island glowed like a small city. He thought of the baby's first breath and of a pilot's first landing after the fight. And for a long moment, those two victories felt like the same victory spoken in different tongues. Somewhere astern of that floating city, ordnance crews stacked bombs nose to tail with the same unhurried competence Ellison had brought to boiling bottles. Both rhythms said the same thing. There would be enough, today and tomorrow. Dawn found Ellison under a tent fly with her ledger open to a page smudged by iodine thumbprints. She totaled the week. Births, feeds, bottles boiled, gallons issued, clinic visits turned away, only when fever had broken, and sleep would do more good than a stethoscope. She passed the figures to the MIS team chief, who handled numbers with the same care he gave to verbs. Data became sentences. Sentences became leaflets. The plan was blunt and pastoral at once. Your wives and children are alive at Camp Susupe. They eat, they sleep. You may see them during posted hours. The loudspeaker crew tested the battery and read the script into the wind. There was no boasting in it, no American swagger, only times, places, and promises the system could keep. Marines escorted civilians in family groups along a marked path. The processing table, shaded by the hull of a Sherman, had a scale for packs and a clipboard for names. A private, who had learned the habit of deference from a mother in Ohio, bowed awkwardly to an elderly man and handed him a cup of water. The man bowed back, startled, then drank like a pilgrim. A grandmother surrendered with her daughter and a granddaughter whose hair had been singed at the edges by a cave fire. The grandmother whispered that she had been told to jump from the cliffs. The interpreter nodded slowly and said that would not happen here. Ellison showed her the bottle rack and the schedule chalked on a board. "Every 3 hours," he translated. "The baby will eat every 3 hours." The woman looked at the clock and began, without knowing it, to rebuild her day around something other than fear. Leaflets tumbled down into the mouths of caves, skittered across coral, slapped wet against the trunks of coconut palms. The message gathered weight with each mother who returned to the entrance and called inside in her own voice. The MIS chief logged which caves answered, which fell silent, which might need a second visit with a softer script. This was not romance, it was procedure. That was why it worked. Each number Ellison wrote made another sentence possible, and each sentence saved a life from the cliff's edge by converting rumour into routine. At noon, a CB brought over a rectangle of pierced steel planking for the clinic floor. "Keeps the mud honest," he said. Ellison laughed, not because it was funny, but because the sound lifted the ward an inch above the day. She checked the totals again and underlined them. Ramirez took a stack of leaflets and went walking toward the ridge, the paper warm against his palm like a living thing with something simple and necessary to say. Over the reef, a boat's wake stitched the lagoon straight as a seam, and the loudspeaker carried across it like a bell calling a town to supper that did not yet know it was invited. Coral dust rose in curtains as CBs drove dozers like blunt instruments shaping a cathedral. Sections of pierced steel planking clanged into place, graders smoothed coral fill that would settle into a bomber strip before the month turned. The smell was salt, hot iron, and emulsified fuel. A bicycle clattered past the work party, Ellison riding side saddle with a crate of formula balanced in the front basket, a sight so ordinary already that no one stopped to marvel. The island's two miracles advanced in step, runway length and bottle count. At the dispersal bays, a cadre of ground officers walked tape measures across outlines of future giants. B-29s, they said, with the certainty of men who had already seen the shipping manifests. 4 engines, pressurized cabins, bomb bays big enough to change the conversation in Tokyo. Ramirez listened as if hearing about a distant weather system that would eventually roll over this tent in the form of contrails. He did not need the specifications to understand scale. He only had to look at the fuel farms rising behind berms and the way trucks seemed to get out of their own way. Back at the clinic, Haruko learned the weight of time again. Feeds at 3-hour intervals, visits posted on a board, a laundry line of swaddles blinking in the sun like semaphore from another, gentler fleet. Grandmothers traded recipes for rice that wasn't there and laughed anyway at the absurdity of appetite. A hospital ship's boat nosed in, took on a feverish infant and 2 GIs with shrapnel wounds, and slid away without theatre. The path between tent and sea had been worn smooth by repetition. Numbers at the map table started to feel less like boasts and more like simple inventory. American factories had built roughly 296,000 aircraft across the war. In 1944 alone, they turned out around 96,000. The figure was not posted anywhere. It hovered in the air like humidity, present in every spare part, every replacement aircraft, every box of spark plugs. Japan, for all its courage and skill, could not conjure industrial ghosts into metal at that pace. Even a mother new to American words could tell the difference between scarcity and a system designed to eliminate it. By evening, the runway glowed dull under the first floodlights, and the ward glowed warm under lamps turned low. Ramirez stood between them and felt the strange pride of a man who had helped tend both a flight line and a bottle rack. Far beyond the reef, a ship's light marked a steady point on the horizon, and he imagined B-29s lifting past it one day, noisy as salvation, while somewhere behind him a baby slept through history's changeover. The island seemed to breathe in two measures now, one in octane and tonnage, one in ounces and minutes, and the wonder was how naturally they kept time together. Maury walked out under a white cloth cut from a bedsheet, the cloth juddering in the trade wind like a heart that had finally decided to beat. He expected humiliation and found formality. Rifles at low ready, a sergeant with a clipboard, a table shaded by a Sherman's tarpaulin, a scale to weigh his pack, a bucket of water with a metal dipper. He set down his pistol, his maps, his notebook. The interpreter saluted and introduced himself by name. The salute was not required, but it landed like a small bridge thrown across a chasm. They took his statement in the neat, unhurried script of men who have paper to spare. He described orders to die, the grenades given to families, the rumour of bottles boiled in a tent that smelled of soap. He admitted he had sent scouts, and they had returned with chocolate and a schedule. He looked toward the lagoon, where amphibious tractors moved on a timetable that did not notice the existence of his doubt. The sergeant ticked boxes and initialed margins. It felt like joining a bureaucracy that had conquered the island simply by arriving with enough of itself. Ellison walked him as far as the clinic edge and let him look through the flap. A mother slept with a child's hand fanned across her collarbone like a star. Bottles dried throat down on a rack. A nurse lifted a kettle and the steam lifted with it, white on white. "We will keep doing this," the interpreter said, and the sentence struck Maury harder than any insult. It wasn't promise or threat. It was procedure, and procedure was victory made humble. The numbers, when he forced his mind to them, broke his old compass. In 2 days over these islands, American pilots had destroyed on the order of 600 aircraft for a loss of about 123. Destroyed in 48 hours more than his service could hope to replace in a season. Back on the beach, he counted amphibians without meaning to, and the count kept running. He had learned that by March the Americans had accepted around 1,890 LVTA-4S 75mm guns slung on tracks, and Saipan's defenders had begun with perhaps 80 tanks. The ratio felt like a door closing on a corridor that had once looked endless. He signed the form with a hand that did not quite shake. The sergeant tore the top sheet free and handed him a copy as if closing a purchase at a hardware store. A Marine pointed him toward a line where water steamed in a galvanized tub for shaving. He felt the weight of his signature like a pack set down after a long road. The white cloth fluttered once and fell quiet. The cave behind him kept its heat. His mind did not. He had surrendered to a system measured in tons, minutes, and mercies. When the guns cooled enough for paperwork to breathe, the record revealed itself in layers that fit together like bayonets to a scabbard. Unit war diaries described sweeps by company, grid by grid. Civil affairs notebooks logged soup ladles and clinic hours with the same gravity as ammunition issues. Navy after-action reports tracked hospital boats cycling to white hulls off the reef with a regularity that would have impressed any railroad man. Reading them side by side did not embroider romance. It showed that compassion had been docketed, assigned and executed within the same disciplines that landed a corps on a reef and pushed it inland. The pattern was plain. Mercy had been planned. The civilian hospital beside Camp Susupe existed on the operation order alongside artillery fire plans and patrol schedules. Interpreter teams rotated by roster like mortar crews. Requests went up the chain for inspection access by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and replies came back with dates and names. The same logistics that fed regiments fed enemy infants because the doctrine said stabilization reduced friction and freed combat power for the next ridge. The phrase lacked poetry, the results did not. Numbers stand at attention when called by a clerk with a straight back. American assault strength on Saipan approached 71,000 against roughly 31,600 defenders. US casualties would tally into 5 figures, about 3,100 killed, 13,000 wounded, while Japanese military deaths dwarfed their small number of prisoners. Civilian losses ran awful and hard to reckon, 8 to 10,000 by the best surviving counts, many falling to coerced suicides that no ledger can fully hold. The aerial ledger was even harsher. Over 2 days, the Philippine Sea became a sump, swallowing Japan's carrier-trained skill in a ratio that only got worse as the months wore on. The exchange, about 123 US aircraft for roughly 600 Japanese, was not a fluke of luck. It was a function of radar, training pipelines, replacement airframes, and fuel drums that reached like a causeway from the heartland to the reef. A nurse drawing a bottle at Camp Susupe and a pilot strapping in on a flight deck were actors in the same production. In the margin of a diary, someone had written a sentence that could serve as a synopsis for the whole campaign. "We made room." The handwriting might have belonged to a Marine, a Seabee, a nurse. The meaning belonged to the Republic. Room for runways, room for ledgers, room for error that could be corrected, room for an enemy child. From such rooms, history changes its furniture and the future learns where to sit. The map, once only ridges and fire sacks, now carried softer marks, drainage ditches to keep the clinic dry, a widened path for litters, a note that a tank should idle at noon to cast shade on the waiting line. No single line looked heroic, but together they traced a policy you could walk with your eyes closed. Follow it, and you arrived at a ward where steam beaded on lamp chimneys, and mothers learned a new word by its feel. Enough. The thesis sounded sentimental until you graphed it. Stabilize civilians and your rear area stops bleeding attention. Your engineers work under fewer alarms. Your interpreters talk to informants who no longer expect death. Your patrol routes shorten because families point out old firing lanes and fresh booby traps. The maternity corner in a tent city was not a sidebar to victory. It was a line item. Ellison's ledger, quarts and minutes became as operationally relevant as a fuel dump inventory. When the guard detail didn't triple as escorts, the Seabees poured coral faster. When coral flowed, runways hardened. When runways hardened, the future arrived on schedule. On the runway, tempo crept upward with metronomic certainty. A Seabee foreman could show you the curve. Square yards of coral laid per day, PSP sheets placed, fuel tankage completed, revetments finished. Tie those curves to camp numbers, and you got a compound interest a banker would applaud. When mothers didn't fear an ambush fetching water, the guards needed fewer men. When guards needed fewer men, trucks moved without escorts. When trucks moved unmolested, steel and fuel reached the airfield on the hour. The orchestra tuned itself. By autumn, you could feel the future's weight in the Marianas, even if you had never seen a continent. US Army Air Forces officers walked the dispersal with the distracted air of men counting forward. Spares, plugs, props, tires, oil. Back home, factories delivered about 96,000 aircraft in 1944, part of roughly 296,000 for the war, and those figures were less boast than background music. They explained why a hospital ship could take on an enemy infant without a single memo needing to be elevated beyond a commander who already knew the answer would be yes. The enemy did not collapse because he lacked courage. He collapsed because he lacked redundancy. A doctrine that made suicide a tactic could not make autoclaves appear on time or keep fuel drums filled across oceans contested by fast carriers and submarines. Maury, now a prisoner, watched a bottle rack drain and fill, and understood the deadliest thing about his captors was not rage, but schedule. Mercy repeated is policy. Policy repeated is power. When Ellison signed her ledger at dusk and clicked her pen shut, she felt something she would not name until years later, when a student asked her why the United States won. She said it started in factories and shipyards, but took shape in places like Susupe, where you did not hoard your last match. You lit the stove for a stranger and scheduled the next boiling. That is how a democracy flexes. It spends to save, and because it can, it does, and because it does, it wins. Somewhere over the horizon, B-29 crews rehearsed checklists until they could speak them in their sleep, and the tempo on the ground matched that litany. Feeds every 3 hours, vaccines at 11, boats at 1400, an orchestra of plenty tuning for the last act. The war ended and the paper scattered, orders stamped in purple ink, ledgers that smelled of mildew and iodine, photographs labelled in pencil, Susupe, 44, steam and rain. Years later, you could still open those pages and feel the heat of the tent, the clack of a typewriter, the careful exactness of a nurse's hand. Veterans would shrug at sentiment and point instead to procedure. We made room, they would say, and you could see what they meant without a speech. Room for runways, for cradles, for the long logistics that turned mercy into policy. Impossible numbers endure because they explain gentler memories. The United States built roughly 296,000 military aircraft across the war, about 96,000 of them in 1944 alone, more in a single year than Japan produced across the entire conflict. It accepted around 1,890 LVTA-4 amphibious gun vehicles before spring of that year, while the defenders of Saipan counted perhaps 80 tanks. B-29s left the lines by the thousands, 3,970 in all, and when they rose from new coral runways in the Marianas, they carried not only bombs, but the weight of an argument already won on the ground. Abundance beats cruelty. Haruko would have told you, had you asked, that what surprised her was not the scale, but the ordinariness of kindness. A schedule on a chalkboard. A nurse who said every 3 hours and meant it. A Marine who shaded a queue with his tank as if that were the point of armour. She heard later about carriers and the turkey shoot, about contrails that braided the sky to Tokyo, and she believed those stories because she had already believed the smaller one, that a nation brought hot water to a battlefield and did not apologise for it. Ramirez finished the war with the same watch he had used to time a breath in the cave. Years afterward he tapped the crystal when a second hand stuck, as if urging the island's old heartbeat to keep time. Ellison taught nursing and, when students asked why America won, she surprised them by starting with milk. From milk she went to factories, from factories to ships, from ships to airfields, from airfields to missions that ended a tyranny that confused cruelty for strength. Maury lived, a quiet man who admitted, when pressed, that schedules scared him more than guns. What remains is not a fable, but a usable inheritance. American industrial democracy did not just outproduce an enemy. It learned to aim surplus at humanity and found that mercy, repeated, scales. The baby who cried in a cave is an old woman now, and whenever she hears a kettle begin to sing, she remembers the steam lifting in a tent on Saipan and understands, more clearly than any statistic, what victory sounds like when a free people decide there will be enough.